It's 11:30. I am happy to leave the floor to Maurizio Ferrera. Maurizio, a few years ago, we have introduced this annual lecture at the end of the presentation of the PhD program. Okay. So this year, as I said, I'm happy and honored to have Maurizio Ferrera here with us, giving a lecture on the title Ideology, Conflict and Solidarity in the EU Moving Forward. I think there is no need for presentation for Maurizio. I mean, he's one of the leading scholars worldwide in comparative welfare state research, and also especially in the last 2 decades, he has researched substantially and in depth in the process of European integration, especially by looking at the possible emergence of the European social dimension or European social union. So he is also, as I mentioned at the beginning, president of NASP and member of the faculty board of the PhD program in political studies. So I stop here. I leave the floor to Maurizio. Very happy to have you here.
Okay, so they changed the battery, so hopefully the mic will work, and this gives me the possibility of standing. Okay, the title of the presentation is Ideology, Conflict and Solidarity in the EU, which is also the topic on which my research has been focusing in the last years. There's also this appendix moving forward to give you an idea of the type of argument that I am going to make. Let me briefly give you an idea of the sequence of the presentation. I will start by presenting my research puzzle. Then I will briefly spend some time on concepts and theoretical propositions about ideologies and their relationships with respect to conflict constellations, and the wider process of community building, which is, of course, a relevant challenge for the European integration process. Then I will have a central section on the process of European integration. I will be very brief here, summarizing a lot of research in which I will outline the main steps, but also the main challenges that the process of European integration has faced in terms of community building precisely, and trace such challenges back to ideologies and ideological conflicts. Then there will be a section on the challenge of solidarity, which is a key dimension or aspect of community building during the so-called poly crisis, but also after the poly crisis, hoping that the poly crisis is actually, if not over, much weaker now, with some ideas about future perspectives. Okay, so let me start with the puzzle. There has been in the last 10 or 15 years a sort of ideational turn in both EU studies, but also in research about the welfare state, an increasing recognition of the relevance, explanatory relevance of ideas, but not necessarily ideologies. In fact, the concept of ideology has long suffered from a pejorative connotation, due to the Marxist tradition, but also within the pluralist tradition, ideologies have been traditionally treated as dogmatic patterns of political thinking. Yet we know from research, the literature and debates on historical processes of state building, especially during the 20th century, that ideologies have played a key role in structuring political conflict and more generally in the process of formation of nation states. And political actors themselves, when talking about the crisis of the EU, during the last 15 years or so, have repeatedly evoked the idea of an existential crisis due to use President Macron's expression, a civic war of ideas. There has been a lot of debate about the neo or ordo-liberalization of Europe, that is to say, the rising hegemony of ordo-liberal doctrines, but also, of course, of Euroscepticism, nationalism and populism. These are all used to be, apart from Euroscepticism, if you think of nationalism, especially a key component of the ideological landscape of the 20th century. And according to some scholars, I'm thinking prominently, mostly about Fritz Scharpf and his school, the EU was born as a Hayekian project. That is to say, a project inspired by the political economic theory of Hayek and the classical school of neoliberal economics. And Scharpf himself, even though Scharpf, as you probably know, has analyzed European integration, especially in terms of institutional factors, the famous institutional asymmetry argument, even though he then explains the process of European integration in these terms, nevertheless, in a famous article of the late 2000s, says, well, this Hayekian project, for some reason, was never challenged by, he says, good Europeans, the Christian democratic leaders and intellectuals that played such a big part in the launching of the European process, and then, kept criticizing the institutional asymmetry and the neoliberal flavor taken by the integration process. So my puzzle is, or my question, what exactly has been the role of ideology, as opposed to just generally ideas, in shaping European integration and also originating the polycrisis? And to what extent has such role been causally autonomous? And this implies, and I shift to my second point, a short analytical digression. What do I mean by ideology? I already mentioned the pejorative connotation in the literature, political science, and sociological literature of the 1960s and 70s. However, more recently, especially within political psychology on the one hand, but also within a strand of research that developed especially in the UK around the works of people like Michael Frieden, who founded a very important journal, the Journal of Political Ideologies. There has been a reconsideration of the very concept of ideology in a less, let's say, normatively neutral and evaluatively also neutral direction. So in this tradition, I defined ideologies as sets of shared ideas. True, ideologies are sets of ideas, but a specific kind of package of ideas, because such ideas display a recognizable organization around a core of descriptive and normative meanings. The British school argues that ideologies have a specific morphologies, with a descriptive and normative dimension. And these, bundles of ideas provide actors with a heuristic for developing political orientations and also orienting their behaviors. Ideologies circulate within the political sphere through discursive practices. This is also a notion that has become very fashionable in neo-institutionalist political science. And what matters is that these sets of ideas are, let's say, aimed at making a difference in the practical sphere of politics. And they do so by, let's say, having an impact on motivations, on actors' motivations. So they are not only, they have this in their morphology, but they are elaborated precisely with the purpose of motivating political actors to action, okay? So in this sense, we may raise a more general question, and this is partly a philosophical and even metaphysical question. So what is the causal role of ideology? For Marxists, ideologies are structural epiphenomenon, right, of more basic material structures. However, Max Weber, for example, had a different position. For him, ideas, or as he says, ideal interests play an autonomous and at times decisive role in historical development. They serve as switchmen. They can actually move historical development from one track to the other. And this is the famous thesis that he outlined in his master opus, the Protestant Ethic and the Rise of Capitalism. So to make a long story short, the relationship between ideologies, interests, and then organizations, such as parties or interest groups, is not predetermined. And actually, I argue, especially in reference to the state building tradition that is linked with the works of Stein-Rokkan and Marty Lipset, that ideology has in fact can have a causal role. I mean, it can help individuals, situated individuals, in actually identifying and defining their interests, and therefore in prompting organizational forms that help political mobilization and collective action. And, Rokkan and Lipset are famous. He introduced this concept of political cleavages. Political cleavages are persisting, pervasive, obdurate oppositions between groups of people that are stable over time, and are certainly related to an interest base in the social structure. They are, let's say, supported and reproduced over time by organizational structures and networks, party systems, or corporate systems. But they are essentially, driven and originated from ideological vision. The first cleavage, as they call it, of modern Europe was the religious cleavage, right? Religion is not an ideology, but is a predecessor of ideologies, right? In fact, there is a literature that defines ideologies as secular religions. So a cleavage typically opposes one part and another, and this opposition is also, rests on an opposition of interests. It is reproduced and, let's say, sustained by organizational structures, but it initially, is born from the elaboration from ideological worldviews, which of course shifts then the thread of explanation on how do ideologies emerge, how do they develop, and if you want to argue that ideologies have an autonomous causal power, then you have to identify specific features of ideologies which do not depend on interests and on organizations. Because of course, there's always, a coevolution, and the distinction that we are making here, at least in my view, are not metaphysical, but are analytical, okay? So this is a reconstruction that we researchers propose of how the social reality works. Okay, now let's get more into this concept of ideology. Ideology has obviously a partisan dimension, okay? Which is based on, the choice of a given value or sets of values. And based on this initial choice, ideologies compete against each other in the appropriate or pertinent political arenas. And partiality stems from some normative assumptions that sometimes are implicit or taken for granted. And what is characteristic of ideological assumptions is that they are, I use this word here, decontested. So it's not a philosophical doctrine, because in a philosophical doctrine, the philosopher is well aware or remains aware that the starting assumption can be essentially contested, right? But there's no absolute fundament. While in ideological thinking and in ideological, patterns of thought, there are assumptions which are, so to speak, subtracted from essential contestation. So liberty is this, it's non-interference, okay? And I put it there, and then I build an argument from this normative conception, which I probably draw from philosophical discussions, but I'm not interested in discussing the starting assumptions. I'm interested in using the starting assumptions to elaborate a world view with a view to making an impact on practical politics. Now, partiality, if you think of it, implies logically the existence of a totality. That is to say, a collective membership group which provides the context of ideological competition. Now, I want to make an impact on practical politics, and therefore I want to motivate as many people as I can. And this collective membership group, especially in developed political systems, is endowed with a political sphere which provides arenas for interaction, where ideologies or ideological standpoints can confront each other. However, the existence of the continuance and the persistence of such arenas which words and characters, ideology-driven interaction on a continuous basis encourages, each ideology, or let's say, ideologies don't have legs and don't walk, right? So ideological carriers, actors, to gradually develop a communal dimension. This is a distinction which is scattered around different literatures, including in not only in political theory, but also in classical political sciences, a la Aswell or Easton. And the communal dimension of an ideology is the existence of a kind of attachment, which can be utilitarian, but also affective, or the result of inertial process, to the total membership group, to the polity. Because in order to affirm the goals and objectives of the specific ideology, you have, of course, to interact with other people that, belong to a single field of interaction, so that you can actually try to shape collectively binding decisions in the desired direction. So, communal aspect of ideologies. A set of basic ideas, empirical, but also imagined. Think of this metaphor of the historian Benedict Anderson, according to which the nation is an imagined community. About the membership group as such, resting on the acceptance of the polity as an appropriate, pertinent, and legitimate institutional and also legal battlefield, from which each actor derives a shared underlying interest in polity maintenance, in maintaining the polity itself, despite disagreements and conflict. So the major, let's say, concept that I use in my empirical question, which has to do with European integration, is the concept of ideological communalization. To what extent, I mean, the development of such shared set of ideas about the political community and its desirability, whether for instrumental or, let's say, normative reasons, is a condition for polity building and for the durability of the polity through time. I just invite you to consider what happened in the early history of the nation states when they reached the phase of democratization, okay? So take Christian democracy, the secular ideology of the Christian faith. Okay, the challenge for Christian democracy, which was actually a very serious one, and let's say troubled Christian democratic parties for long decades, especially during the first half of the 20th century, was to shift from the idea that the only, target, the only group that was of interest for this ideology were religious communities, the communities of people sharing the Christian faith, to groups of equal citizens in the democratic state. And the same is true for the left ideology, from the international community of proletariats to, again, groups of equal citizens in a democratic state. And only after, these two ideologies developed what I call this communal values, the acceptance of the democratic nation state as the context within which to mobilize their followers and to reach their political objectives, did conflict turn from a almost irreconcilable opposition into something that could be amenable compromises and therefore could be leveraged upon in order to stabilize and consolidate polity institutions. Okay, now let me turn to the more empirical historical part. I will not discuss, which I do in my book, about the challenges of communalization that had to be faced at the level of the nation states during the first half of the 20th century and also later. I just concentrate on European integration because this process was launched in the 1950s. And as Sharp clearly stated, although I think with an interpreted mistake, European integration rested on some clear, if implicit, ideological basis, a view of the world, a view of how society should be organized, and especially a view about how to protect the primacy of economic markets. So, if you want to if you have a set of individual, single, and relatively self-contained national polities, and want to establish a meta-polity, like the European community, you have two challenges as a, as an ideologue, let's put it that way. There is a vertical challenge, how to justify ideologically the vertical transfer of power and the establishment, although gradual and incremental, of a novel polity, which results from compounding a set of previously independent nation state. So this was the Europeanization. The challenge here was the Europeanization of the communal aspects of each ideology. To some extent, each ideology, Christian democracy, socialism, liberalism, had to incorporate within the communal aspects that had gradually led them to accept the nation state as their horizon, incorporate within this a new horizon, the European horizon. On the other hand, the second challenge had to do with the partisan dimension of ideologies. And this had to do with the redefinition of values and goals, which had been, thought and calibrated to the scale of the nation state in order to arrive at some partisan view about the mission, the goals, the overall profile of the European Union as a novel polity. And the challenge was important because only to the extent that communalization, at a certain degree of communalization could take place, would conflicts around the process of European integration refrain from becoming polity undermining. So, polity undermining meaning not accepting the construction of the new polity as such a principal position, right? So here we find what I call in this slide the original sin of the ideological structuring of EU building. Well, first of all, of course, everybody talks about federalism, but if you look at history, federalism remained an enlightened ideology of a few intellectuals, but never really gained a traction at the mass level. The socialists and the communists refused and rejected the very idea of a process of European integration. So they remained anti-system. They thought, and there's a lot of documents confirming this and a lot of historical literature that confirms that for them, European integration was just a capitalist plot, something that went against the basic principles of socialism and a fortiori communism. It was also something that was born or was being born as an anti-Soviet Union project, so they didn't want to participate. It was also a relatively small project at the beginning, so they didn't realize, that the force that such project was, deemed to have in the future. So they refrained from participating to debates. They voted against their own treaty. They didn't participate to supranational institutions. They did not mobilize against European integration. You know, there's an expression in the literature, and the expression is the permissive consensus. You know, a number of authors argue that between the 1950s and basically the 1990s, European integration remained an elite project that was not politicized by these elites. And there was a general consensus that it was among public opinions, that it was a desirable objective. So nobody really mobilized against it. True. But this was also a result of a deliberate choice by a number of political actors not to politicize. Okay? So the ideological foundations were not only, as Sharp argues, liberal, let's say, linked to economic liberalism, but they were especially, they were shaped or they were extended to the Christian democratic ideological template. The Christian Democrats, Gasperi, Denauer, Schumann, they embraced the idea of supranationalism as an instrument for promoting Christian values such as peace, democracy, polity for everybody, and also the fight against famine. But they also the original ideological and the brilliance of the integration process, the doctrine and the theory of the principle of each line. That's fine. Supranationalize, they also wanted, they were in favor of the common European defense, for example, a project that failed, especially due to the social position in France. But they didn't want to integrate the social dimension because their worldview was impregnated with this principle of social solidarity, which of course also defended the specific interests of the churches and their activities in sectors, distance, education, or even healthcare. So there was this convergence between the liberal and the Christian democratic ideological templates, which led, however, to what I call here a lopsided communalization. There was the virtual absence from the very beginning of a leftist view of integration. And the result of this, again, from an ideological perspective, was the development of the social democratic consensus, so-called at home, and economic liberalism, more or less, intense, depending on the relative strength of Christian democratic and liberal leaders in Brussels. Okay, now the story is very long and I only have time for a very cursory overview of what happened afterwards. And by afterwards, I mean from the end of the so-called golden age or glorious 30s of the social democratic consensus. And basically the beginning of the crisis. So let me briefly explain to you what happened. Remember that I am interested in isolating the specific and therefore autonomous impact on ideology. So I accept and I know everything about, you know, the changing constellation of interests and the erosion of the working class, everything that the literature has said about, you know, the cultural and socioeconomic transformations is relevant as a general context. But my argument is the ideological dimension, developments in the ideological spheres cannot be regarded or treated as side products of the restructuration of interests, cultural orientations, or organizational dynamics, which is the way in which ideologies are mainly treated, not only, let's say, by Marxist approaches, but also by mainstream political science. You know, ideology in the Schumpeterian tradition, ideology is something which is tactically or strategically developed and used to attract consensus of voters. So this is the driving factor of ideological development. Now, I provide a different story. In my theoretical framework, I explain that there is an internal endogenous dynamic of the ideological sphere that may lead to the internal exhaustion of the motivational capacity of an ideology. And it's a long story, but basically this exhaustion has to do with what I call the reality check. The fact that the visionary side of an ideology, when it gets operationalized and is transformed into concrete institutions, it gives origin to certain dynamics that retroact on the vision and weaken its capacity to motivate. And this is what I argue about the social democratic consensus that prevailed during the so-called golden age, which is highly, overestimated. It was an expression and also a line of thinking that was born in Northern Europe and that basically described developments in that area. But in the south of Europe, there was a lot of conflict of ideology. Countries such as France or Italy, the so-called what Rocan calls the fifth cleavage, namely the separation between communism and socialism in the wake of the Russian Revolution, which, by the way, was purely a doctrinal split. There was nothing that had to do with interests, material interests as such, only interests as defined by ideological, assumptions. So this cleavage, which, like the religious cleavage, had been born entirely within the intellectual, ideological realm, prevented for long periods what I call the communalization of the left, the full acceptance of the systemic characters of the democratic nation state on which these ideologies compete. And these were anti-system ideologies well up until the 70s and in France even later. So the exhaustion of the social democratic consensus had a number of consequences. No, it was coupled with the financial crisis. We know about that. Okay, I just want to isolate this particular aspect. At the domestic level, it created a void which was filled by market liberalism. Why was this void filled by market liberalism? Because market liberalism a la Hayek had never disappeared. You know, actually, in some European countries, especially Germany or the UK, but especially in the US, the ideas of Hayek had been, you know, the object of sophisticated re-elaborations, also, you know, by professional economists, and provided, you know, it was there, provided a window of opportunity. No, they provided an alternative ideological template, which could be, which mobilized itself, because it was available, mobilized itself at the moment when the Keynesian social democratic consensus entered its, you know, exhaustion, phase of exhaustion. There was the beginning of a phase of intense fragmentation of the left, but there was also the rise of right-wing nationalism. Now, here again, I contest the argument that nationalism and sovereigntism was an effect of European nationalist currents had survived, you know, underground or in peripheral niches of the ideological landscape of European countries in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And, you know, again, was ready to bloom. I use the metaphor of a karstic river. You know, ideologies flow through time like karstic rivers. Sometimes they go underground, only to reappear, you know, later on when the conditions are propitious. And also populism. Populism, well, was flourishing at the time in Latin America and then became the object of specific ideological theorizations later on. So it's not so true that populism was there already, but to some extent it was. So what were the effects at the domestic level of this ideological, as I call it, destructuration? Well, the stretching of the left-right frame. The left-right frame, as you know, had become the prevailing dimension of competition in domestic arenas during the so-called golden age. And this left-right frame was stretched to the right because of the rise of neoliberalism and neoconservatism, but also to the left because of the, you know, radicalization of left-hand movements. And there was also, because of the resurrection of nationalism and then populism, the rise or the appearance of alternative schemes or dimensions of competition based on the in-out and up-down positions. I cannot get into this. I have a whole chapter in my book on the fact that ideologies always contain in their profile spatial, from space, imaginaries. Left, right, up, down. These are the ways in which positions are framed. And this is something that seems to be a universal feature of human culture, at least if we listen to social psychologists and also cultural anthropologists. And the in-out and up-down frames are inherently oppositional. They are inherently oppositional because they, while the left-right frame is malleable and does not have a, a predetermined content, it's changeable, it's malleable. It allows for centripetal compromises. The in-out and up-down frames do not have this characteristic, and actually they are mobilized precisely to create highly conflictual oppositions. So this is what happened at the domestic level, while at the EU level, well, instead of just generally neoliberalism, you have the entrenchment of a specific ideologies, which is German ordoliberalism. But you also have persisting ambiguities within the left. Now, the ambiguities regarded several aspects of the integration process. In some cases, for example, the northern left were ambiguous and, sometimes explicitly contrary to integration as such. You have to remember, I have no time to discuss this, that integration included more and more member states through time, therefore incorporating new national traditions, new national ideological constellations, their own specificities. So the challenge of communalization was not resolved, if there was, once and for all, precisely because it represents itself at any moment in which a new member state or a new constellation of ideological positions becomes a member of the European Union. So the British Labour Party, the Labourite ideology, and the Northern, the Scandinavian social democracy, they were national ideologies, okay? For reasons that have to do with their, historical evolution during the first half of the 20th century. So they were against, and they remain against integration. They welcomed, market integration, but they were against expanding the social role of the European Union. And this ambiguity increased with the accession, first of the UK and Denmark, then Sweden and Finland, and also the Central and Eastern European countries. And also, I must add, I haven't put it here, the persisting opposition between maximalism, and reformism within the left. We all think that the French referendum of '92 and then the referendum of 2005 that rejected or almost rejected treaty revision was due to the rise of Euroscepticism. No, it was the result of a very strong opposition and mobilization of the left, even within the socialists. So, and then of course the rise of Euroscepticism. So, in terms of communalization, what happened? There was a decommunalization from the right, because ordoliberalism is a programmatically non-communal ideology. I can expand on this if you're interested. There was a persisting weakness of the left-right scheme because of the lack of the left-right polar star, as our colleague Mauro Barisione calls it in the recent book. And the rise, and to some extent also the persistence, of polity undermining anti-EU opposition. So this is the way in which I see the ideological contribution to the crisis of European integration that I think was already there before the explosion of the various substantive challenges that hit the EU in the 2010s. So this is a scheme. Only the liberals, or let's say the social liberal, I include here, the third way type of reformist left, and the populars remain loyal to the EU polity. EU polity as an appropriate, political action, and also as an appropriate political context for ideological competition. And then you have the challenges from ordoliberalism. I call it here iconocracy. I would have to make a big detour on the role of the economists and the economic profession in destabilizing the communal foundations of the European Union polity, ethnic nationalism and populism, and the radical left, especially in France. So this all entered into a dramatic funnel of, ideas, slogans, buzzwords, the opposition between saints and sinners, coined by ordoliberals during the financial crisis. The idea that Europe should be based on regime competition. The anti-elitist critique of populists, national patriotism, and also regional patriotism. Not to speak of course, again, an ordoliberal feature, ideas about the need of affirming a market-conforming institutional setup for the EU polity. Left anti-capitalism and anti-Euro radicalism. Think of Varoufakis and his ideology. So this produced, put them all together, and this produced a phase of dramatic and intense decommunalization, a deep decommunalization. I call it even a moral conflict laden with moral judgments, and of course an identity conflict. And we arrive at the expression coined by then Macron in his Sorbonne speech, a civic war of ideas. Now, I have one more part, 2 or 3 slides on recommunalization, which is the, let's say, the part of my argument that is summarized in the idea of a process of moving forward, okay? So, in order, given the context that I have described, we can speak of ideological recommunalization if we observe the emergence of a shared consensus on 2 overarching principles. The EU is a desirable type of political community, and preservation, polity preservation, implies a modicum of loyalty vis-a-vis constitutional values, including norms of social sharing. And here is where I bring in directly in this presentation the notion of solidarity, because from Weber onwards, the concept of community also evokes the idea of bonding, of social bonds. Well, I do see signs, and I document them in my book with public opinion data, interviews, and other analysis of party documents, a weakening of the ordoliberal orthodoxy, a gradual de-radicalization of ethnic nationalism is still among us, we know. But nobody, even Le Pen, is now openly voicing for dismantling the European Union or for exit from the European Union. So the us, them, and the up-down frames have been partly weakened. And also, as we know, the extreme right is divided. There has been a de-radicalization of the extreme left. Now, with the partial exception of France, and a process, and this is the most important part, a process of ideological convergence within the, let's say, reformist left. Again, a long story. I see the signs of this ideological convergence in the gradual, let's say, appearance and convergence towards a number, I call them here, meta concept. And I draw this expression from the pragmatist tradition. If a new meta concept, general, abstract concept, competence is coined and then thrown into the sphere of public communications, it tends to create its own public. This is John Dewey's famous intuition, capacity of ideas to create their own publics, and therefore to serve as tools for social and political mediation. Okay, to take the concept, I just make one example of social investment that has become so prominent in the discussions about Europe and especially the European social dimension. Well, this concept comes from Scandinavia and the ideological tradition of the Scandinavian social democratic parties. It was uploaded into the agenda of the European Union by some, let's say, norm entrepreneurs that became members of the European Commission or created epistemic communities. But for the Northern Social Democrats, social investment was something that they already had. So insisting on this concept and uploading it at the European level did not represent any threat for them, right? It was actually a way of showing off the superiority of their domestic experience. While in the other member states, in other ideological traditions, this was a lever for demanding more social. Because we want more money from the European Union to help us convert our systems into social investments. So the emergence of new goal-oriented conversations, it's relatively general and malleable to adaptation to local conditions. And I see this in the regarding social investment, the European Pillar of Social Rights, the idea of a European Social Union, the Green Deal, and the concept of the just transition. So they changed the conversation, right? And this allowed for eventually, the gradual, let's say, convergence towards some sort of progressive social vision of the European Union. And I distinguish here three different sub-dimensions. The promotion of common social standards to foster international solidarity and also upward convergence. This is still the theater of very harsh conflicts between the South and the North, the lefts of the South and the North. I mean, with the approval, the adoption of the minimum wage directive has been challenged by the Danish and the Swedish trade unions supported by the social democratic parties against the Court of Justice. I don't want that. But it, you know, they accepted it when it was adopted by the parliament. A fair regulation of free movement, this was also another explosive question. To what extent should workers of other member states be allowed to enter the national labor market and welfare solidarity spaces of the nation states? And again, the Nordics were very jealous. They didn't want Latvian or Lithuanian workers to actually go to Sweden and enjoy or take advantage of their mobility rights. And finally, this was a major achievement at the level of cross-national solidarity, which is an important aspect of a compound polity like the EU, as it was also always a very important topic in processes of federal communalization. The inter-unit transfers of resources. And there again, first we have to have summary of the convergence, the points of convergence. Just read the manifesto, the European manifesto of the socialists. That was a manifesto that was signed by all the social democratic belonging to the social and democratic group of the European Parliament. And it's a much more ambitious, but especially a much more precise and homogeneous document than it was only 10 years ago. Okay. I don't want to spend much about the incoming election. We can speak about it in the debate if you want. I just want to show you the last slide, which would be not the end stage, but the emergence of a minimum of favorable conditions for the EU to establish itself as a adequately communalized, a new compound polity. Because the EU cannot be other than a compound polity of national democratic welfare states. It cannot become a federal state. You know, the weight of the national democratic welfare state as a political form of organization has always been so heavy. In fact, if there is a logic that the EU has to follow to establish itself, is it has to remain a polity which can consolidate itself to the extent that it also consolidates the national democratic welfare. There cannot be a contradiction, a clash, a tension. So it will remain a diverse, a complex system of both horizontally and vertically in terms of ideology, with a persisting inherent potential for eliciting destructive, what do I mean by destructive? Polity undermining, conflict. But now potentially capable of making room for left-right restructuring of ideological competition, channeling conflict in a constructive direction. Territorial conflict will remain as it remains. It has remained in all, historical federations. But if there is no, let's say, parallel consolidation of at least a modicum of cross-local, cross-territorial, functional alignments based on the sharing of similar ideological orientations and not just territorial identity, the EU will not be able to survive, really. So the risk is always and inherently there. So it has a potential for resilience thanks to this, if it meets these requirements, but also remains crisis prone. If you're interested in the full argument, 12 chapters, you are welcome to take a look at my book, which has just come out. And this is the result, as Matteo said, of 1.5 ERC projects that I started back in 2014. And you can also go and visit the website of the second project, which is called Solid, at this link. Thank you very much.
So thanks, Maurizio, for this inspiring presentation. I think we have some time for discussion. As we aim to basically close the meeting around 1 p.m. So we have roughly 20 minutes. If you have a question for Maurizio, the floor is yours. I think that if you want to speak, it's better that you keep the mic here. Andrea Ruggeri.
Thanks, Maurizio. This is very important work. I have one clarification and then one provocation. So about the ideological communalization. So I can now grasp, for instance, nationalism is that kind of phenomenon for the nation state. But we also know that nations and states have not been overlapping. And actually, in certain situations, we have states with multiple nations and nations without states. Could you translate this within the European Union? So what will be the kind of ideology or ideologies of reference, and how can be similar tension of nation and state? The second one is, and maybe it's a bias of being a scholar of international politics, is to what extent the elements it's suggested, and especially the deconstruction of polity building and therefore the negative conflict, could be influenced by external dynamics. So to what extent do you think we are really controlling the dynamics of the European Union if, for instance, there is a change in the leadership of the US, if, for instance, China decides to step up also in the security matter? So to what extent are we missing the international dimension besides the European Union in this story?
Any other question? Teresa Pullano, please.
Thank you very much for this extremely inspiring talk. I have two questions, comments. Maybe I didn't understand correctly. I don't know. I will go ahead. I had the impression that there was at times an overlapping in your speech between two different meanings of ideology. Of course, you differentiated ideology 1, 2, and 3, but sometimes I feel that in the three of them, it overlaps ideology as the content, what ideologies are saying, liberals, socialists, etc. And then I have the feeling that there is another decisive point, which is ideology. You named it maybe as a meta concept, but I would name it as a grammar or a form. You spoke about morphology. So my question is, isn't your point really about ideology as a form, as a grammar? And then I have a second point related to that. If we think about these other meanings, which are connected, of course, right? But if we think about this other meaning of ideologies as a grammar, then it becomes also more clear how the historical, social, and political factors are central in shaping ideologies as grammars. And here I'm thinking about causally, Begriffsgeschichte, for example, or also the work of Boltanski on theories of justifications inspired by Dewey. So this is one point. And the second point is, if this is correct, couldn't we say that the European Union is a process of rescaling of ideology in that sense?
Okay, on Andrea, on nationalism. Yeah, there is an ambiguity here because historically, what I call ideological communalization did tend in Europe to converge towards the image of the nation, okay? So the nation as the community. And then, not always, there was a linkage, a strong link between this imaged community and the state infrastructure, and this link produced the nation state, which did not, absorb completely other national images at lower levels. And that's originating a type of conflict aimed at endowing each nation without state with its own state infrastructures. However, I distinguish between ideas of national community and nationalism is an ideology. Well, so nationalism as an ideology is a partial ideology. I mean, nationalism can be the partial dimension of an ideology, which starts from a normative assumption about the superiority, the higher desirability of my nation vis-a-vis the others. This tends to be true also of nationalism in the weak sense, but this has, over time, given rise to a weak, version of the image, which some scholars call banal nationalism. So it's just the flag at the back of or hanging on public institutions. So that is what you connect with the nation, but you're not really, you accept and you give it for granted that your horizon of your key horizon of political action is the nation state. But what really matters for you as partisan is not the nation, but it is social justice versus negative freedom, or other. And this is, of course, true of many, I mean, universalistic ideologies also have this problem of how to accept the fact that political interactions in the world now take place within bounded spaces. Okay, so they have to accept the contradiction between the universalistic vocation of their own worldview, even liberalism, and the fact that you have to compete in bounded spaces. So you have to calibrate to some extent and redefine your universal principles to make them fit. And in the book, I also say or discuss Europolitanism as a new version of liberal cosmopolitanism that accepts the fact of boundaries that prevent, the full universalization of values, and that therefore even if pro tempore, force actors to interact within a certain delimited field of interaction. About external challenges, I agree with you. However, again, I would respond by saying that my interest is only on the ideological dimension per se. Okay? So if Trump is elected, then my interest is in the challenge that this external ideological novelty or development has for the ideological complexion of national societies and the European Union. Then, of course, ideologies also reflect, factual developments. They are not just elaborated up in the air. So there will be an elaboration about the normative and descriptive components of the partisan dimension of the ideology itself. Now, about Teresa. Yes. When I mention the morphology, the concept of morphology, of course, I think of what you say. And in the second chapter of the book, I actually try to sort out all the, let's say, the rules, the constraints that are connected and that result specifically from grammar. Okay, I call them endogenous formal constraints. Okay, for example, just to make an example, a left ideology versus a right ideology. The left ideology is more constrained because it has less margins for combining different concepts, because they are logically related. So you cannot be for social justice and at the same time be xenophobic, right? While you can be for a free market and be xenophobic, or you may be for a free market but also be liberal. Okay, so the left has a multivocal grammar which allows for more margins of maneuver, and this may be an advantage in certain conditions. Okay, so and I give a number of I analyze a number of formal constraints, and then in the empirical parts I highlight the autonomous impact of these formal constraints that have to do with the specific morphology of that ideology on, for example, the motivational impact of the ideology or its reaction to certain, factual challenges. So you're totally right.
Good. Any other questions from the room?
And the rescaling.
Marcello? Other possible questions? Okay, you go.
Okay. Ideologies and institutions are closely interrelated, of course, because institutions always incorporate more or less explicitly some assumptions about how the world, social reality works, and they also incorporate, you know, some normative assumptions. There cannot be anything which is purely instrumental. You know, there's always a value or normative fundament in anything human. You know, there's a strand of thought that argues that institutions are frozen sets of ideas, right? Because when they arise, they are the result of probably compromises between different maps, normative and descriptive, that actors involved or participating to institution building have. And they are also, no problem about that, result of power struggles. You know, and ideologies are power resources. And I also subscribe to the idea that there are path dependencies and inertias. They are institutional in the strict sense, so they are exclusively or merely connected to the organizational structure of a given institution, but they are also partly related to the ideology. I just mentioned that the morphological structure that emerges at a given point in time within an ideological bundle then inevitably tends to constrain subsequent developments. Because there is the limits in the extent to which you can combine different concepts. Agreement. So this was your first question, right? But again, I would say my aim is not to determine whether ideologies are more important than institutions. It's just an analytical focus that it's a beam of light that I cast on reality, which is complex and heterogeneous, and I want to sort out how exactly this particular entity, which is a bundle of concepts to which I impute the term of ideology, because, you know, identifying ideology is again an act of analytical reconstruction, right? You have to reconstruct an ideology from a number of different sources. And, you know, there are some established definition of what this or that ideologies are, but then there is the core, there is the periphery, there's the perimeter. So it's always contested where the boundaries of an ideology. But these are, let's say, partly epistemological, partly methodological questions that I do not want to address here. So my intent is just that of pulling out the role of this particular dimension, net of, if possible, net of the role of other. Now, the entrenchment of ordoliberalism in the macroeconomic governance of the European Union was very, very intense especially with the fiscal compact and the two packs. I mean, the dissertation of Federico Bruno is entirely devoted to analyzing ordoliberalism as an ideology in its morphology, also with the help of empirical analysis of speeches by actors such as Schäuble or Merkel, and tracing their content back to prominent figures of the ordoliberal. And then Federico has also made an additional step. He has, reconstructed according to a certain procedure, has reconstructed the morphology of ordoliberalism on the one hand, and also reconstructed a stylized profile of the ideological underpinning of the macroeconomic regime, and there is a very, very close correspondence. Now, certainly, when you move from that kind of template, based on the concept of ordo, of market conformity, on discipline, on rule-based behavior, to notions such as common insurance, common debt. If you read the speeches of prominent political actors, for example, during the COVID crisis, you cannot but note a 180 degrees conversion, okay, from there. I mean, the very idea that there is a community of faith clashes with the basic assumption of ordoliberalism, for which there cannot be a community of faith and there cannot be a political community, because the political sphere is an arena of rent-seeking. So the concept of regime competition or jurisdictional competition, which is a key tenet of the ordoliberal ideology, clashes programmatically with the idea of polity building or community building. It can only be an atomized arena for efficiency-based competition among actors. Yes, there may be, ordoliberalism is not just a theory of fiscal stability. It has many other elements. What I see re-emerging are economic doctrines that, put the emphasis on the need of containing inflation and restoring fiscal stability. Some of these doctrines do not really oppose the potential establishment of common debt-funded European funds, because a European fund, even if it is funded through debt, does not raise the problem of moral hazard, which is, the taboo for ordoliberalism. So it's some ideas are reappearing that had been displaced during the last years, but I don't see the danger or the risk for the moment of a aggressive resurrection of the template.
Thanks a lot, Maurizio. We have a very final question by Francesco Zucchini, please, and then we can go for lunch.
If I realize it correctly, the project of somehow Europeanize the ideological arena, according to your interpretation, is easier now than maybe 10 years ago, because of the development that you observe mostly in the leftist area. is okay. But I mean, these projects must depend also on the level of centralization and importance of the European Union institutions. So according to your point of view, the current European government is sufficient in order to allow these Europeanization somehow of the left-right dimension. Because historically, we observe left-right cleavage when the state is already built up and when somehow there is already a centralization of the power. So how is it possible that this Europeanization of the left-right dimension take place now with the current governance? You say, okay, look at the COVID episode, but this depends precisely on the perception of a threat. So you need another threat in order to change an institution, in order to observe all of this, or ideology can make the job somehow, I mean, can affect without any other change.
Thanks, Francesco. Let me partly add just final notes. I mean, just to conclude also, because we are facing the European election soon, let me just play you with the crystal ball. How do you see like your framework, the ideological evolution of the radical right in the, let's say, short term? Because that is key, definitely in light of the axis of competitions that you highlighted in your presentation.
Okay. Francesco, to some extent, is a chicken and egg problem, right? So you cannot have the emergence of a strong central government if there isn't a modicum of ideational support for the establishment of central institutions, and the establishment of central institutions are possible only to the extent that territorial conflicts have been partly tamed by the emergence of cross-local functional alliances. And the emergence of cross-local functional alliances presuppose in their turn an ideological base that pushes actors to come together in order to pursue certain shared goals. So this is, this is what happened with the establishment of the left-right dimension in national systems. It could only develop when the class cleavage found a suitable ideology. This is splendidly documented and illustrated by Stefano Bartolini's book on the class cleavage. He said, nothing would have happened prior to the emergence of a suitable ideology. That was socialism. And the same is true with Christian democracy, right? You had to have some degree of communalization and cross-local functionalization based on Christian principles in order to centralize, especially those areas and sectors that were the preserve of faith-based organizations. Now, a full explanation of your question would require a more complex scheme than my scheme only based on ideology, because one would have to look at processes of organizational structure. Okay? So you have a suitable ideology. You have these processes of ideological convergence. You have meta concepts, elites come together, and they are engaged in a conversation that is no longer based on territorial visions, that is based on, let's say, I use functional, you understand what I mean. But then nothing happens if there is no link with the interest constellation and with the organizational structure. So how I see the European integration process at the moment is that this process of ideological convergence, which has resulted from autonomous, this is my point, autonomous, endogenous dynamics, has also been accompanied by a process of organizational structuring, which we are now documenting in the SOLID project. It is to say the emergence of organizational arenas, links, cross-party, but also across the trade unions that allow to this growing ideological sharing of ideas to actually transform themselves into policy demands, into political demands, okay? And the huge centralization of funds and competences that took place as a result of COVID was, of course, related to the external challenge of the pandemic and the nature of this crisis. But it was also, in my view, the first important political exchange at the EU level involving significant resources. It was the Socialist Party that bargained with Ursula von der Leyen in Parliament prior to the formation of the parliamentary majority after the elections in 2019. You have to include into your program the minimum wage directive and sure this program 100 billion euros funded through debt. But this was quite a change, right? It was the result of a political exchange that was only possible because there had been this process of convergence in the trade unions and within the Socialist Party. They had this program that had converged on these ideas. They were able to use this resource, we all agree on this, in order to push for this institutional reform. Now it's there. And then that was the NGEU, the facility. And now the socialists are demanding we should keep them, or we should establish more common funds. Now, if you listen to the debates, that's what they are asking. So we want to keep this centralization of, while von der Leyen is now saying, we must use private capital, okay? Because she wants now to have the support of the Popular Party, okay? But then who knows what happens after the elections? No? So I think that a threshold has been reached, whereby there are enough resources controlled and distributed at the central level, which have resulted from functional cross-territorial alliances supported by ideological commonality that are now potentially able to trigger off a process of coevolution that will lead towards an institutional growth of the European Union. What did you say about the right? I think the right is in a situation of extreme ideological fluidity at the moment. You see, AfD has been expelled. Le Pen has approached the European conservative and reformists. She now says, oh, we are not pro-Putin. We are pro-NATO. Okay, so there's a lot of movement at the moment, of course, which is to some extent prompted by the elections. But I think that behind this there is, I don't know because I have not researched, but there is an ideological discussion in those, let's say, relatively hidden for the moment partisan arenas in which electoral incentives join with the autonomous weight of ideological elaborations. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Maurizio, for the presentation and all the answers to the questions. Thanks everybody for listening to this very long annual lecture and questions and answers. I think we can go for lunch after more than 2 hours. And clearly for potential applicants, we very much wait for looking forward to your applications. Remember, the call for application will be launched on May 29th, and it will remain open until June 27th. Okay, so be ready, especially for project collaboration, to be included in the application. Thanks everybody, and see you soon.